because these algorithms, they operate at such speed and scale that humans cannot physically react before thousands of trades have already been executed.
There's part of me that thinks, what happens when there's nothing left to transform? What happens when we've transformed all this legacy tech?
You may be teaching it how to make you redundant.
Yeah. The risks come from the incredible speed of development and concerns of bad actors using AI maliciously.
I think could get to a state where...
And that's not laziness or lack of willpower. That's your brain adjusting to the loss of expected reward. You're working against a temporarily disrupted motivation. If this happens, you can be at the mercy of your emotions and be so stirred up that you can't talk yourself down or think your way through the situation.
When thousands of trades execute in milliseconds, the human in the loop becomes an empty concept. For years, regulators relied on strict human in the loop oversight to ensure automated systems remained under control. But as these models evolve, this manual safety valve is showing its limits.
Kind of strict HITL. This is where the system literally stops and waits for a person to approve before it proceeds. So the AI makes a recommendation, or maybe it performs some kind of subtask, but then a person is going to need to make the final action, give the go command, say, hey, let's do it. Now, in the middle, you've got something called human on the loop.
Waiting for human approval is a bottleneck that cannot withstand the operational speed of modern AI decisions. As digital platforms rush to integrate frontier AI models, traditional governance frameworks are beginning to crack under the pressure.
You can't change fast enough to prepare for what's coming.
You can use AI to prove that it's not AI.
What happens when there's nothing left to transform?
If our compliance frameworks cannot adapt as quickly as the algorithms they monitor, the entire system becomes obsolete. To manage the massive scale of frontier AI, international regulators are establishing collaborative frameworks to bridge historical policy gaps.
We're here to speak about how the US and Europe can find common ground on regulating big tech. We have a fantastic speaker lineup from both sides of the Atlantic to explore the best ways to bridge the ongoing transatlantic gap on digital. It's also pretty good timing because US and EU officials met yesterday for the inaugural meeting of the US-EU Trade and Tech Council in Pittsburgh.
Finding common ground on big tech regulation is no longer optional. It is a global security requirement. Relying on outdated compliance methods is no longer a viable way to govern an economy powered by real-time algorithmic decisions.
Topic of re-embedded government regulation. Some people would say, oh my God, that's kind of arcane, but at the core of it, regulation is really fundamental to the operation, the fundamentally smooth movement of how our government, how our society, how our economy works. It's really core to actually keeping things going. And so it's a very important topic that actually affects a lot of different areas of American economy, American life.
Effective regulation is the hidden foundation that keeps the modern digital economy stable. As AI capabilities accelerate, the risk of bad actors weaponizing automated systems becomes a primary concern for global safety. Advocates.
Director of the Center for AI Safety says the risks come from the incredible speed of development and concerns of bad actors using AI maliciously.
I think could get to a state where the positives, where we can enjoy the positives if we bring AI development to a more cautious risk level.
Mitigating systemic risks requires bringing AI development to a more cautious, predictable risk level. Traditional regulatory audits cannot keep pace with systems that update their parameters in real time without human guidance.
There's an awful lot of meat there. There's an awful lot of statements that are provocative, but are not provocative to be provocating. They're provocative as a result of a lot of thought. Before I open up the discussion, I'd just like to pose two questions if I could. First, you talked a lot about Basel III. You talked a bit about Congress, about the Fed's role.
Relying on slow legislative updates leaves regulators constantly chasing a rapidly moving target. The risk-benefit equation for high risk technologies must be fundamentally reevaluated when human oversight is removed from the loop.
We've talked about this before, that the concerns around nuclear have always been cost overruns and safety. What specifically has changed about the risk-benefit calculation where governments are now saying, maybe it's not such a bad option?
Speed and cost savings mean nothing if we lose the ability to safely control autonomous systems, while some regions lead in frontier tech development lagging. Regulatory agility can leave others economically and technologically vulnerable.
We've also had, and this is the first and foremost problem, which Mario points out many times over, we've had extremely slow growth. Europe is lagging far behind the United States, both in general economic growth, in new initiatives, and particularly in technology.
Stifling growth with overregulation is just as dangerous as letting autonomous tech run completely wild. Geopolitical shifts are forcing nations to establish strict digital sovereignty and native policy initiatives to protect their critical infrastructure.
Range of issues here, including the techscape, the challenges before India, and government policy, rules and regulations, and so on.
Crafting national policy requires balancing domestic innovation with strong indigenous regulatory safeguards. The arrival of Frontier AI mirrors the early days of the web, forcing human systems to quickly adapt to a brand new operating reality.
Extent of AI, what impact it's going to be. I know when the web first came around, people were just overwhelmed or didn't know the impact, and it really became something it morphed into something that we all adapted to. So now we're adapting to AI. So this is really the goal of the webinar, to discuss what these panelists are doing with AI in the language process.
Adaptation is inevitable, but we must ensure we are guiding the technology rather than just reacting to it. When automated loops disrupt human feedback systems, it can lead to massive cognitive friction and erratic decision-making behaviors.
Dopamine drops, and that drop doesn't just affect motivation. It creates a kind of mental whiplash. You might feel flat, unmotivated, or like, what's the point? And that's not laziness or lack of willpower. That's your brain adjusting to the loss of expected reward. You're working against a temporarily disrupted motivation system.
Stripping human checkpoints from fast-moving systems ruins the natural rhythm of decision-making. Visible system failures are only the tip of the iceberg. The deepest structural vulnerabilities remain completely hidden below the surface.
One way to examine your anger is to think of it as an iceberg that has a visible part above the surface of the water, but then a much larger part lying beneath the surface that you can't see. The visible part is the situation that triggers your angry response. In the middle, just below the surface, is your hurt feelings and unmet needs. Then at the deepest layer is fear. Let's look at an example of how to analyze this together.
True systemic risk isn't the trigger event itself, but the hidden layers of anxiety and structural weakness beneath it. When automated systems bypass rational checkpoints, they leave organizations completely vulnerable to catastrophic decision-making.
If the amygdala is overactive, it can override the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex and block them from giving us information that is reassuring. If this happens, you can be at the mercy of your emotions and be so stirred up that you can't talk yourself down or think your way through the situation because you're missing the perspective information from the hippocampus and the reasoning ability of the prefrontal cortex.
Bypassing structural controls eliminates our capacity to rationally navigate system-wide crises. As automated systems assume more control, workers face the reality of training the very models designed to replace them.
Then yes, there is the other element where the AI is going to take our jobs. I work in transformation. There's part of me that thinks, what happens when there's nothing left to transform? What happens when we've transformed all this legacy tech?
You may be teaching it how to make you redundant. Yeah. On the other hand, there's always been those fears.
The ultimate irony of the transatlantic regulatory dialogue is shifting focus from vague ethical guidelines to concrete controls on key frontier technologies.
To discuss this, what did you make of the conclusion? They seem to be focusing on things like AI, trade-focused issues like export controls and investment screening. Were you happy with how this turned out yesterday?
Concrete policy alignment True regulatory reform requires visionary leaders who can bridge the gap between complex engineering and civic responsibility.
Tim is the kind of guy who's thought deeply about how this technologies work. He has a lot of forward motion where the world's going. He's got a civic mindedness. He actually has a very innovative brain, and he actually is constantly applying how can we actually take what we're learning, in particularly in these technology circles, but also in just the fields pressing the future, and actually apply them to civic issues and civic uses. And so we've got Tim to kind of run this one, and as our model reinventor.
We need leaders who understand the mechanics of technology, not just the politics of regulation. Digital policy is no longer just a local issue. Antitrust, consumer protection, and data privacy investigations are popping up worldwide.
Data protection, consumer protection, various possible deceptions, and where is the piece that antitrust fits in? There are investigations, as you know, all over the world. This is not just the US issue. The investigations started elsewhere. Investigations in some cases, Germany, EU, UK, Australia, South Korea.
Fractured global landscape makes it incredibly difficult to enforce unified safety standards on frontier AI. Financial regulators are constantly balancing the need to reduce systemic costs without undermining the foundational protections that guarantee stability.
Are there ways to think about taking some costs out of the system without sacrificing any of the benefits? So on that front, I think you're going to see continued more sort of rollback on that. Having said that, I mentioned that most but not all of the regulations from Dodd-Frank have been promulgated.
Stripping away compliance protections for the sake of speed is a recipe for long-term systemic failure. Stripping away compliance protections for the sake of speed is a recipe for long-term systemic failure.